Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Data Privacy Party installment. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Data Privacy Party installment. I'm your host, Hunter Sunbeck. Now let's go ahead and get started. Not going through the traditional setup that we did for kind of talking through latest breach news. You can listen to a lot of them in the previous episode that we kind of recap the halfway point of 2023. Today we'll kind of cover some brief information y'all need to know. So we'll start with some HIPAA breaches. So two of the kind of largest ones that have happened since they started tracking breach statistics. Managed Care of North America, a business associate out of Georgia, had a network server be compromised and hacking incident. So, someone stole the credentials to a server. There was some information stored on that server. It was exfiltrated. That had over 8 million individuals affected in that breach, which actually is the record at this point based on what the OCR keeps statistics for. That happened back May 26, 2023. The other ones, this is now the second largest one, PharMerica Corporation saw over 5 million, almost 6 million records stolen. Network server was compromised in a hacking incident. They are a healthcare provider out of the state of Kentucky. So if you know that you have some sort of business with either of those, highly advise that you go ahead and take a look. The PharMerica Corporation hack occurred on May 12th, 2023, or at least that's when it was submitted that there was a breach there. So highly advise you kind of take a look at have you been contacted yet by either of those companies? What are they doing to protect your information? See what you can do to see how much you were impacted. Other big news is we have some new state privacy laws coming through. So we kind of talked at length about several of them on the last episode. But as we suspected and talked about, Texas has now passed and signed House Bill 4 into law that's going to be taking effect in the next couple of years. Let me get an exact date for you guys here in a second, but that bill we're going to see as having a little bit different applicability thresholds than the rest of them. So no revenue threshold, no processing threshold, no seller sharing threshold. Really the only big area to determine if it applies to you or not is if you are considered a small business under Texas code, then this regulation would not apply to you. There's some other details in there that kind of suss that out a little bit, but that's kind of for the most part, if you're not a small business, then you can get carved out of that regulation. This bill is going to take effect on January 1st, 2024. So that's not far away for those of you that are tracking. We have, halfway through 2023 at this point. So you got 6 months to kind of get things in order, kind of look through the regulations, see, are we meeting those requirements? Most companies, I think, are from a privacy and policy standpoint. There might be some technical requirements that you may need to get in order. Other state that recently passed, and so still requires a signature, it's going to be signed soon, is the likely scenario, Oregon Senate Bill 619. So this one doesn't have a monetary threshold. It does have a processing threshold. So any company processing over 100,000 or more data on consumer, 100,000 or more consumers, and then that same 25% or more revenue generated from the sale of personal data, and also processing 25,000 or more consumers' data. Same general one we've seen across some of the other privacy laws that have kind of come through recently, like Tennessee and obviously Colorado, Utah, but don't forget about Iowa, Montana, those that are kind of very brand new, all coming into effect soon. So Oregon's law, there is not a hard date just yet that's been set as far as compliance by. I would highly recommend you get compliant by, or at least understand if you're compliant or not, by January 1st, 2024. because it's very likely that that one's going to kind of follow the same thing as like what Texas has done, what some of the other states have done. I know Tennessee, as a reminder, is not coming into effect until July 1st of 2024. Montana is not till October 1st of 2024, and Iowa's not till January 1st, 2025. Indiana, January 1st, 2026. So as you can see, some of them are coming on the horizon very soon, such as Texas, but then there's some that are very far out, like Indiana and Iowa. So obviously, Oregon is going to fall within that range, but it's better to be proactive than reactive when it comes to privacy law regulations. All right, jumping right into today's lesson as we keep going through the Introduction to Privacy textbook right here, the same one that helped me pass the CIPT exam. Talking about identity and anonymity. And so this sounds like a simple concept, but it might be a little more complicated than you might think. It's definitely more of a subjective concept in some instances rather than objective, but let's go ahead and crack into it. So then a reminder, this is very high level. We're not going into the dirty details on a lot of these things, and I highly encourage folks to do their own research, but this is just to provide sort of an insight, a peek through the window, whatever you want to call it, into what are the things that are out there that I need to be doing research on, looking into, if you want to go after a privacy certification, as well as implement some privacy controls in your own organization and in your own personal life. This isn't just for organizations, but also for consumers, so you can kind of understand the lingo as well as know what to do when you need to do it. So we'll start with identity. So what is identity exactly? So there's a couple, depends who you ask, kind of thing to know what exact definition is going to apply. But the definition we are going to apply is a combination of codes or strings of text used to represent an individual, device, or browser. The identity is the link between an individual and the data that is about them, the metadata, in other words. Some examples of this, I mean, it can kind of range from 1 to a couple hundred, depending on the data points, but some easy ones, and these are ones that you can find in HIPAA regulation, for instance. They kind of call out, I think, about 18, but obviously name, first and last name, unique IDs or login name. So those of us who use our email address as our username for some sites, that would be considered a unique ID. Next one that I had written was email address. So that one we just talked about too. And then biometrics, handprint, fingerprints, iris scan as well, even voice print is also one that is used quite a bit. Facial scans, a lot of us use our phones in order to unlock them, especially if you have an iPhone. Using your face to unlock your phone, very convenient. That's an example of a biometric identifier. And so like I said, the list kind of goes on for those. Those aren't the restricted for. There's several others. That's IP address is another one of them that comes to mind. But and we'll talk a little bit more about these when we get into the anonymity part of it. But you can think of it as different data attributes or data elements that constitute an individual's identity. So, and it ranges as far as how to identify the person based on who you're asking. It kind of goes back to the context-specific processing we were talking about a little bit. And so it's in what context does someone understand who the individual is? Now, for instance, someone who may not know me at all or has never heard of me, and they happen to see my just physical home address on a data set, they're not going to know that was me. They could probably do a little research and figure it out, but they would have to combine different sets of data in order to actually make it so that I'm an identified individual. One on its own typically is not going to be enough in most cases. Now, obviously, if there was an email address, a little different. If someone were to use their first name dot last name at Yahoo, Gmail, Hotmail, whatever place, and so that shows another, I guess, opposite side of that would be if someone that I know well that has been over to my house sees my address on a data set, they know instantly, oh, that is where Hunter lives. So it depends on who you ask, kind of in this sense, where we're talking about individually identified individual based on some data, and kind of how the context around who it is that's interpreting it knows how to identify you. Moving on to talk a little bit about authentication. This is one that I'm sure everyone listening is fairly familiar with. So this ensures an individual performing an action matches the expected identity of that individual. So kind of there's 4 main categories of this, and there's kind of a 5th one that's being brought in, and I'm sure you can think of a 6th or 7th if you have enough time on your hands. But it's something you know. So a password, string of characters, password 1, 2, 3, 4. What you are, biometrics, we talked about, handprint, fingerprint. What you have, so a little token, smart card, something that kind of gets plugged into your laptop, or something that you can verify your identity with. It exists outside of you, outside of your mind, as well as outside of your physical body. Next one being where you are. Where are you located? Geolocation. Are you logging in from a IP address that the organization blocks? Then in that's going to kind of tie into not being able to authenticate because you're not within a restricted kind of sphere or circle of trust, in a sense. You're not, if you're trying to log in somewhere from China, there's not a heavy likelihood that if your organization recognizes your IP address is coming from there, that you're going to be able to log into wherever you're trying to get to, especially if you don't have the other methods that they require. Kind of a 5th one that not everyone employs, and it's not one that's talked about very much, but it's definitely one that exists very much depending on the type of business that a company is in, or the type of product that needs to be accessed, is essentially just when you are. So are you able to, at what time of the day can you log into your system? So maybe an organization implements a hard, employees are only allowed to use our systems between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. And you can even set it, Central, Eastern, whatever time frame, but you can only access it during this window of time. And anything outside of that, the system's not going to be accessible. And once it hits a certain point, maybe they have some reminders that come up, 30 minutes, you're going to be logged out, 15 minutes, 5 minutes, countdown. Just kind of saying, hey, you are going to be logged out because we can't have people accessing the system during this period of time. Not a common one, that last one, but one that it depends on the type of business and product that we kind of see from time to time. So just quickly recap. What you are, which are biometrics, something you know, which is a password, something you have, a little smart card or a token, somewhere you are, geolocation, and then just when you are, what time of the day is it, and what are the parameters for logging in. Encrypting passwords at rest and transit is kind of the best method of preventing various nefarious actions, such as man-in-the-middle attack that can kind of intercept some of those communications. If they don't have the encryption key, then they're just going to see a jumble characters. They're not going to be able to actually see what that message is. Another method to kind of help out is enabling account lockout after a specific number of invalid attempts. This prevents brute force attacks from going further. It maybe look inconvenient that the user gets locked out, but they also don't have someone access their account that's using that's not supposed to. Another style, this goes back to somewhere you are, geolocation information, but location-based authentication. We kind of touched on this earlier, but that's often done at the corporate network level. computers are physically stored in the office, not from an individual's own home. So this is a little bit different than what we talked about, but kind of harpens back to the same idea, is that you can only access a system or domain from a very specific location. So for instance, my very first job, I did not have a laptop, I had a desktop computer. And so there was no possible way, unless I went to the actual facility, that I could access my account from my home. It was, a lot of what we used was very much local applications installed directly to the system. It wasn't really very much cloud-based stuff. It kind of shows you how long ago, and what's funny is it really wasn't that long ago. It just depends on the organization. But for the job I did, it had to be on site. I couldn't take it home with me. There really wasn't a huge reason to take it home with me. And so a lot of it was just on the physical site. So that kind of was a natural authentication mechanism that they added in without having to do any sort of logical controls in place for that. So going down, I talked about this a little bit earlier, since we covered authentication and what that looks like and how to, prove your identity. We talked about what identity is. So some identity issues, mainly, one general one, and I hinted on it a little bit earlier, but it's around how can you tell that an individual would be considered, or rather, a data set would lead someone to believe they have an identifiable individual. So the term individually identifiable differs from individually identified. One, you can tell without a doubt, that would be the identified term, that we know who it is in the data set. There's enough data points and elements in there that we can tell exactly whose prescription it is if it's a healthcare data set. So they have first name, last name, maybe home address, zip code, prescription, maybe even account ID if that's relevant in there, prescription refill date. And so using all that information, we can tell exactly who it is and what prescription they have, when are they going to be refilling it, when can we expect them to probably drive to their nearest pharmacy in order to go get their prescription refilled, which kind of creates several privacy risks for that individual. If there was someone that wanted to, I don't know, find them for some sort of nefarious reasons, then they'd be able to know, okay, they're going to probably refill their prescription every quarter typically. So I'm going to go be at this pharmacy on this date because I know that they have to get their prescription refilled at this specific date. And then, depending on the motive behind what they want and what the desire is from the bad actor, they could do something to the individual without the individual really knowing anything that's going to happen to them. The individual identifiable is one that's a little more up for interpretation, but primarily it involves the expectation that a reasonable person would be able to identify the individual given the current information about them and any publicly accessible information about the individual. So it would essentially be, we're given a data set of, let's call it home addresses, just a data set of addresses that include zip code, city, state. In order to know who's living at that home, I can easily go on to the county tax office's website for where you live. I'm assuming everyone, I can't say that I've been to every single county across the United States' website to know exactly what it looks like, but I know that for mine and an associated county as well that's nearby or adjacent, not associate, I know that I can identify who lives at that house just by typing in the address, and then I can find a little bit more information about that person. after entering in the address. So that gives other, yields other information. I mean, property value, historical taxes, a bunch of different information. But that aside, that kind of explains that, given the public information that's available and then a small amount of private information, can a reasonable individual identify that person by aggregating all that information? The European Community Article 29 Working Party, abbreviated WP29, is how I'll refer to it going forward, suggests that no individual should be identified, but obviously knowing this is in the regulation and what it specifies will help you discern whether or not the information available about the individual can actually identify them. So it goes back to what we just said. It depends on what's out there and publicly and then what's available privately. A comprehensive collection information such as audit logs might also reveal a person's device or username and their identity. So, most auditors, other investigative folks are going to want to see some sort of audit log, historical, device activity or server log report that kind of shows what activity was going on. This can be done for forensics and other stuff like that too, to try to figure out what exactly happened. And so some of that information may reveal the device name as well as who was using the device or logged into the device at the time. Now, obviously, within a corporation, this is kind of like, this is expected. You don't really have a massive amount of privacy when it comes to using company devices. They kind of need to know who's using them at what time. But then if we were to look into me, an end user, using a web platform, Amazon or something like that, and they were able to pull a bunch of audit logs for all the users that were using a specific web server on a specific day and what their activity was, and that shows the username I was logged into, then that might be a little bit different, and where there's a bit of a conflict going on to where they collected personally identifiable information on me without my consent, and they were able to identify who I am because of my ID, because of the credit card I used, because of my device's IP address, products I use as well and buy repeatedly. So it's all kind of not as objective, unfortunately, as what we would like. But the audit logs would be something that I would recommend if you're working an organization that collects those on a regular basis. Just be aware of what information is being collected and what you can use to identify someone as not just employees but also just consumers and how they're protected. Jumping over to anonymization, the second half of kind of what we're talking about, this is something that has become very popular lately on trying to figure out exactly how we can conceal users' identity while still using the data. And so, and I think we may have talked about homomorphic encryption last episode when we were talking about privacy enhancing technologies, but this and that kind of go together in some way. That homomorphic is using information to kind of run data analytics without revealing the identity of the users if you're working with one of those data sets. So anonymization, the definition we're going to choose to use, is the ability to be unknown in a crowd or to be unknown while participating in an event. You can stand out or you can participate in a crowd without showing who you really are. So there's, a lot of different forms like this, especially kind of early days of the internet where there were online forums. Folks would not use their first or last name or anything like that whenever participating, maybe in chat rooms or Discord. It would just be kind of whatever alias. I mean, I know a lot of us had AOL Instant Messenger at 1.2. You just use whatever username and find users that way without putting in personal information to any of that. So you can participate while still not revealing your true identity. Something I know a lot of us probably enjoy, especially in a day and age when it seems like surveillance is almost everywhere. It's nice to be able to be anonymous every now and then as well. So continuing with the definition, this occurs when an individual's data is altered in such a way that is no longer possible to relate the information back to a specific person. So that's another thing too. And the differentiator between anonymization and pseudonymization. Anonymization is irreversible, whereas pseudonymization can be reversed back given what's been done. But anonymization is supposed to be the point where whether we encrypt or change information about individuals, we can't change it back. We can't tie it back to an individual. For instance, if a bunch of users input, they're collecting salary information and they require someone to put their first and last name, but then when you look in the data set, even unencrypted, it's just replaced by, a string of X's or whatever jumbled text stuff. It's not relevant to know who the user is. So I mean, in all honesty, they shouldn't be asking for first and last name in the first place, but that's just a basic example of when would a data set become anonymous. They wouldn't know who it was reporting their salary. They just know that there was salary information reported. And we talked about these a little bit. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them. You can listen to the previous episode to know more about them. But three tools, you could say, to kind of help move someone towards that anonymization area. And y'all probably will remember hearing these, but K-anonymity is that all records in the data set are set apart of K records having identical quasi-identifiers. So an example would be if we have an age and address are consistent across micro data sets. So every single record in each of our 10 data sets, age and address are all required fields in those data sets. They don't all necessarily have to be the same across the data sets, but every single data set has those two categories in it. The next one is called L diversity. This requires there are L distinct values in each group of K records. So for example, an anonymized data set has 3 distinct values for an occupation, probably. And that would, 3 distinct values for something like that would be that you're employed, you are unemployed, or you're not seeking employment. And even a simpler way to understand this is when you fill out an online form or something, there is a drop-down box. So your answers are already preset so as to avoid maybe you giving too much information or giving incorrect information or giving information that would identify you. The last one is called T-closeness. This primarily just ensures the distribution of values in group of K records is close to the overall distribution. So let's say we have a data set, age for everyone in the data set ranges from 10 to 30. We can break those up into 10 different data sets. Each data set age ranges being increments of 3. So we have one with 10 to 13, one with 14 to 16, 17, 19, and so on until we get to 28 to 30. So the range of ages in the larger set from 10 to 30, the distribution is going to be about the same as it is in the micro data sets when we look at an age range of 10 to 13. And that just kind of protects and continues to anonymize the data, make it harder to identify individuals from that data. Another anonymization technique that I want to talk about briefly is, and we talked about this, the same thing in the previous episode, but it's called differential privacy. So this is where you inject noise into a data set in order to kind of conceal some of the values or kind of make the data set a little more anonymous. It hides the impact as well on any one individual on the data set. So we have a data set of 10 people. We buy more than 10 people, but for the sake of the example, a person gets added. So now we have 11 people. The impact that all of their entries based on our data columns is not going to greatly affect the mean, the median, whatever other statistical measures you want to apply to the data. it's not going to affect that in a very significant way. There's enough noise injected into the data set that is going to protect something like that from happening. So yeah, the noise hides the impact of any one individual on that data set. In this, you can determine this based on a very complex mathematical equation, and that helps determine if the added noise is enough to conceal the impact of any one individual on that data set. Perfect privacy exists when the answer is 0. In that equation, the databases of 2, 3, however many databases differ by at least one element. So we know that database 1 has 5 elements, database 2 also does, but the 5th element for each one is different. And so when we run our equation, answer being 0 or as close to 0 as possible, we know the differential privacy is there, and in a sense, we've achieved perfect privacy. One example to kind of talk through about how this would work, we already talked about it a little bit already. Releasing the total payroll of a company and the total payroll of the company exclusive of the CEO. So while neither datum by itself reveals individual salaries, given both these numbers, it's easy to determine the CEO's salary. If we were to use differential privacy to release 2 aggregates, one providing privacy and the other providing the second measure of privacy, the 2 combinations would kind of equal each other out in privacy. So essentially meaning that there's perfect privacy between both data sets. Well, that's everything I wanted to cover with you guys today. Thanks for tuning in. Kind of a shorter episode. I hope to keep it that way and make the other episodes a little bit shorter. We talked at length about the news that was going on in 2023 last episode, so didn't want to include it in this episode. Tune in next time. We're going to go through some usable and useful privacy interfaces and just keep cranking away at the book. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, as also dataprivacyparty.com if you want to listen there. But for those of y'all that have any other questions, feel free to reach out. Find us on the website. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Data Privacy Party install. Hope you learned something new and can better protect your information. Like us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, and subscribe to hear more great content.